Shabbat Shalom, everyone. How are you? We're starting the book of Vayikra this Shabbat, and we are in the third aliyah. Now, this book begins with telling us all about the offerings that were offered in the Mishkan. And in the third aliyah, we have the minchah offering. The minchah offering is a grain offering. It's the only offering that's given that does not have blood. It does not have an animal that's killed. It is made of flour, and the flour goes in the pan, and it's made of oil, and the oil goes in the pan, and it's made of incense. It goes in the pan, and that is mixed up and thrown in the fire as the offering. Now, the first part is thrown in the fire as an offering, but the rest of it is cooked up in a pan, and the priests and Aaron's sons and the priests get to eat it. Now, it also says to season all your grain offerings with salt. So what does it have in there? It has the flour and the oil and the salt, and to go on the altar it has the incense. But what doesn't it have? Do you know what this is? That's yeast. And the minchah offering does not have yeast. Do you know why? Because the yeast represents sin, just like we're going to see in a few weeks during Passover when we eat the unleavened bread, right? So let's look at what all of these ingredients mean. So what's the first one? The flour. What does the flour represent? It represents that Yeshua is the bread of life. John 6:35, he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. So, what does the flour remind us of? That Yeshua is the bread of life. And now let's look at the oil. Do you know what the oil represents? The oil represents the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. Luke 4:18 says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And now the incense. How do we know that the incense represents prayers? Well, there are a lot of verses that tell us that, but Psalm 141 verse 2 is one of them. It says, may my prayer be set before you like incense. And then the salt. Our Torah portion today calls the salt a covenant. It says in verse 13 to season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. Well, do you know why? 2 Chronicles 13 verse 5 says, don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel and David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt? Salt represents something that is permanent. It doesn't end. God's kingdom does not end. It's permanent. Salt also prevents corruption and decay, and it purifies, doesn't it? Salt is pretty awesome, and we read about the covenant of salt in today's Torah portion. And then the last thing, the thing that we don't include, what was that? The yeast. Why is there no yeast in the minchah? Because yeast represents sin. 1 Corinthians 5 verse 6 says, a little yeast works through the whole dough. And in 1 Corinthians 5:21, it's talking about Yeshua. He who knew no sin was made sin for us. He was made the sin offering for us. In 1 Corinthians 5 verse 8, it says, so let us keep the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. And that's what the minchah is, isn't it? It's a grain offering to Adonai. It can also mean a gift. Shabbat Shalom.